Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Megan Faulkner Brown, and I am the founder of the Sweet Tooth Fairy. And I'm super excited to be here today to talk all things cake and sugar and sprinkles and candy, and just give you some ideas of what you can do at home very easily to just take your cakes and kind of make them over the top. Just make them a little bit extra. And yeah, so fun. So first off, I want to say, I hope that you have as much fun as I do walking the aisles of Michael's in the food crafting sections, because there's just so many fun things that you can choose from. And today we have a variety of fun sprinkles and icing toppers and candy. And obviously, you'll see me using the stuff that I have here, but I would just encourage you with the next cake that you're going to embark on, just to just walk those aisles, pick out your favorite colors, your favorite shapes, your favorite things, and just let the creativity flow, because it's all about having the right product to make your life easier, right? So with that, why don't we go ahead and dive in? So first things first, I wanted to just give you some little tips and tricks that I do when it comes to baking cakes and decorating cakes. So for me, a must, like hands down, always do this, is I bake my cakes ahead of time. And then I will level them if they need leveling. And then I'll just take some plastic wrap here and individually wrap them. And then normally I'll put, like the date that I made them, so I can keep track of that. But you probably, maybe you are making as many cakes as we do inside of our bakeries. But if not, obviously, if you just have one cake to do, then you probably don't necessarily need to label it. But if you want to plan ahead and just be a little bit more prepped, then you can, bake your cake a few days ahead of time, put it in the freezer, let it freeze. And then you don't have as much of a time commitment the day that you're actually going to decorate the cake, or, let's say the day of the event, or the celebration. Then you can kind of, space out all your prep work. So yeah, so that's just a little life hack that has proven very beneficial for me. So today, like I said, I'm going to show you just a few things to kind of take your cake over the top. And I have here 3 vanilla cake grounds, and then I have just a cardboard cake circle. And I'm just going to open up my cake grounds, and we're going to layer them, stack them rather. But the first one, I am just going to use just this regular old round cake. And you can see what I'm doing. I'm just taking some frosting and putting it onto the cardboard cake circle, because this is essentially your glue. So this is going to make sure that your cake sticks to the bottom of the cake board. Okay, so I'm just going to set that off to the side. Now, for those of you who saw the fun cake that you signed up to make today, might have noticed that it was full of all sorts of fun things inside. So I'm just going to show you how you do that. It's very, very simple. So I just unwrapped another layer, and here I just have a circle cookie cutter. Now, if you don't have a circle cookie cutter, you could just take a knife, pretend this was an actual knife, and you can just cut around and score out your own circle. So please don't feel limited if you don't have the actual cookie cutter. So you just kind of center that, and then I'm going to push down and remove the excess cake. Now, here's also another tip. You can hold on to this. You can use it for like cake truffles or cake bites. You could also, if you were doing kind of a mini cake, you could use it as another tier to stock on top of your cake, or you just slather some frosting on it and eat it. It's like a little a little treat while you're making your cake. Okay, so while we're here though, I'm gonna unwrap this other layer as well. And now all I'm gonna do is take my frosting and let's move this back down a little. So you do not have to have a piping bag in order to put the frosting on. You can, let's just say you have your frosting in a bowl, you would just scoop it out and put it onto this cake layer. And, but I'd already had my frosting in a bag. So it's just a little convenient for me to bring it that way. So, okay, so here you have just that initial layer. Now we're gonna take the donut one, and we're gonna put it right here. So one other thing just to note, if traditionally, I don't know, I'm kind of partial to 3-layer cakes. Maybe it's because I'm like weird about odd numbers, but if you wanted to do even a taller cake, you would repeat the process that I did where I cut the center of the cake out, and then you would stack it after we put frosting on here. You would stack that, and then you would do your whole one on top. So you just want to make sure that you have essentially a closed bottom of your cake and then a closed top of your cake, if that makes sense. Primarily for like the structural integrity, because as you can imagine, if this cake didn't have anything on the bottom to kind of secure it as far as the cake goes, it would be a little wobbly, or like it could very easily just kind of fall apart as you sliced into it. So today we're just doing the 3 layers, but feel free to do as many layers as you see fit. So, okay, so next, I'm just gonna pipe a little bit more, or pipe some frosting rather, onto this layer. And just gonna give it a little twirl on my cake stand. All right, so here's where the fun part comes in. So as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we have so many fun candies, sprinkles, toppers, things that you can get at Michael's. So at this point, what we're gonna do is just load some of that stuff into the center of this cake. So I did just buy some you know how there's little grab and go candy right there at the checkout counters? So here's some little chocolate candies. There's some gumballs. We have these fun chocolate coins. So really, you can just start putting stuff in, and there's no rhyme or reason. I'm gonna add some sprinkles. I'm gonna add some of these cute little rainbow wafers. We'll add some more. We'll add another coin. Let's see. These cute little sequins. These ones are fun. These are new, these candy rods. Look how fun those are. They're just cute little rods full of pure joy and excitement. Oops, let me get that guy in there. So the other method that you could do is you could just put like all of this stuff into a little Ziploc bag and like give it a shake and then just kind of dump it in. But I just wanted to show you that you can really just add whatever your little heart desires inside, so that when it gets cut open, all this fun is going to fall out, which, I mean, I have to say, it's pretty exciting. It's a pretty exciting thing to cut open a cake and have sprinkles and treats fall out. So here, we'll do this. Fun. I have 6 children, and my 2 youngest are very into leprechaun traps when it comes to St. Patrick's Day. So oftentimes our leprechaun will leave these little gold coins. And so I definitely think this year the leprechaun might incorporate the coins into a fun cake for them. So it's just a fun idea that you could do with your little kiddos. So, all right. So as you can see, we're now filled with treats and fun and deliciousness. And now I'm just going to take this last tier and place it on the top. So we are in studio under hot lights. And so you can see the cake is a little, I don't want to go as far as to say like wobbly, but it's definitely thawed a little bit more. But I would just say at home, it's easier to leave the cake rounds in the freezer just as long as you can, so that when you're kind of, rough and tumbly with them, and when we're putting on the crumb coat, that it's just stronger. It's just easier to work with. So you'll see though that this might look like it's a little, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. But anyway, we'll still be able to get it done. So, all right. Now, again, if you just have your frosting in a bowl with a spatula, this is where you would just take your frosting and scoop it on, and you would just take your icing spatula and just kind of smooth it out. But since I have this frosting in a bag, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just applying light pressure with my right hand, and then I'm using my left hand to turn the cake turner. And I'm just going to kind of slightly raise my right hand as I go up the cake. And this is what we call the crumb coat. And you'll see here in a minute why that is the case. So I have here, this is just icing, just a regular icing spatula. And I guess it's a little offset icing spatula, but I'm just gonna do my best to, here we go, to smooth out this frosting and just give it like a nice, even coat. And the point of this crumb coat is to essentially trap the crumbs and get them to set up into the frosting, so that when you come back with your like final coat of frosting or coats, that you don't have a bunch of crumbs that are just falling through, or showing through rather. And having the cake frozen does help with the crumb coat in my experience. And because sometimes frosting can be a little heavy, like this is just an American buttercream frosting, but when the frosting is really heavy, and if your cake is kind of, if it's like soft and freshly baked and just kind of sitting at room temperature, the frosting will like pull the sides of the cake off. And I don't know if that's happened to you. It's happened to me lots of times in my life. But then all of a sudden you're doing this crumb coat, and then you just see like a whole little section of the frosting just kind of like falls off, and it pulls some of the cake. So again, this is really useful to do when the cake is a little bit colder. The other thing that I do sometimes, depending upon, the cake flavor, just kind of the look that I'm going for with the cake, is you can thin out your buttercream for the crumb coat. So let's say you used cream in whatever frosting you're using for your cake, just add a little bit more of that wet ingredient to thin it out just a little bit. And then you can just get like a nice thin coat of frosting, again, to trap those crumbs and give it that look that you need. One thing too is, if you've heard the term of like a naked cake or a sheer cake, that's essentially just a crumb coat. And it's a really popular, beautiful look for cakes for sure. So I just took this straight edged cake comb and just kind of am trying to give it a more uniform, clean coat. And then I'll just take some more frosting and put it on the top. Forgot my apron today, guys, so I'm gonna get really messy. I'm so used to just wiping my hands on myself, but okay. Let's see. Okay, so you can see it is like, it's not like the prettiest job. It doesn't have to be, because again, this is just you prepping your cake and just getting it ready so that you can then come back and start doing all the fun stuff. And not that that wasn't fun, but the even more fun stuff. And because again, just because of the time constraint and we're in studio, we had to do a little bit of TV magic. So I have another cake that's prepped in the fridge that we're going to swap out here in just a sec. But a couple other things I wanted to let you know. So I believe I have a very, very strong feelings about cardboard cake circles. I just think they're so helpful. Now, there's decorative ones that I love and use, like with every cake as well. But I always do my initial cake on a cake circle that is the same size as the cake rounds, if that makes sense. So that's so that right now, right, we can go and like throw this in the freezer and we can let it set up. And then I'll come back with like a decorative cake board. And then depending upon what we're doing with the cake, and this will make sense when I show you here in a sec, but sometimes like I'll place the cake, maybe I'll put it back, like off to the back of the cake board, because I know that the front of the cake, I want to load with coins and candy and things, you know, so I kind of will position it on a separate cake platter or cake board, knowing that I'm going to want that real estate, you know, if that makes sense. So, so yeah, the other thing is that it just makes it really easy to transport when it's on its own, little cake board. And sometimes, you know, sometimes you have a decorative, not like a cardboard one, but like a nice glass cake stand that you want to put it on, you know? So it just gives you a little bit more flexibility of being able to move it around and position the cake finally where you want it. So at this point, are there any questions? Because Sweet Lorenzo is going to take the cake away and bring back another one that has been setting up. Oh, I will say that with the crumb coat, if you put it into the fridge or freezer, depending upon what you have more space in, you really probably only need to have it in there for like 10 or 15 minutes. The buttercream sets up pretty quickly. And the goal is just to make sure that when you touch it, it's not like tacky and sticky, so that then you know that it's like connected to the cake and that the frosting is there to stay. So here we go. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you. You can show your face. All right. So I just kind of wanted to show you this. I don't know if you can see from the top down, like the overhead. See how I just like positioned it a little bit back onto this other decorative cardboard cake circle. Again, that's because I know I'm going to start loading this up. And normally at a party, well, let me rewind. There's always a front and a back to a cake, even if it's on display and there's 360 degrees around that everyone can see. As the person who's made the cake, you know, there's always the front and there's always the back, because the back, you're like, ooh, maybe there's some blemishes or imperfections that really only you will notice. But typically when you're setting up, you know, a display of treats or a cake, there's a front, right? So this will be my front. And this is where I will primarily focus a lot of like the fun additions that we do on top of the cake. So I just wanted to give you that visual if when I was describing it earlier, like didn't make a ton of sense. But again, it's just kind of positioned back a little bit. Okay. No questions? Are we good? Okay. Please don't hesitate. Don't hesitate to ask. Okay, so at this point, the cake, I put some more frosting onto the bottom of this gold cake plate. And then I just stuck this on top of that frosting like we did with the actual cake rounds. And then that's what was setting up in the freezer. So this is essentially glued together at this point. And again, you really only need 10, 15 minutes or so. Now, again, I have some frosting in a bag. I just dyed this green for St. Patty's. And I'm going to use that same technique that we did when I was doing the crumb coat. Oh, what's happening here? And I'm just using my left hand to spin the cake turner, and my right hand, I'm just kind of squeezing with some equal amounts of pressure as we go. And this part does not have to be pretty because we're going to make it pretty. And I'm just going to show you something kind of easy and quick that you can do that looks really fancy, but isn't necessarily. So, okay, so then we're going to go back to what we did earlier with the crumb coat, where we're just going to kind of smooth it out, make sure that we have enough frosting to cover the crumb coat. And I'm just taking my, this cake turner's acting a little silly at the moment, but that's okay. So see how I have, it's messy, right? There's not anything, not like totally smooth. If at this point you like had some fun cake combs and you wanted to add some texture, awesome, you could do that. If you wanted to smooth it out, you can do that same technique that we did just previously with the crumb coat, but I'm just gonna show you something that you can do with your spatula or just like a spoon, even at home. You just take, just kidding, we have a question.
Can you use any kind of frosting?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Let me repeat the question. So Lorenzo said someone was asking if you could use any kind of frosting, and the answer is yes. The one thing just to keep in mind is that if you're doing like a traditional, like whipped buttercream, it's really light and it's, made with cream and it thickens up. It's a very, very, very light frosting. And so the tendency for some of this stuff to stick to it isn't going to be, it's not as like generous as when you have the buttercream that's like a little bit heavier. And that it like sets up a little bit differently. But in terms of like this technique and like with the frosting and with this technique I'm going to show you, you can totally use whatever frosting. I think in my world anyway, I think most people do use just like a buttercream frosting, and it's really pliable and it's really forgiving, and you can wipe it off and restart. Whereas like a true like whipped cream, it's just a little wetter and a little trickier to work with, but you could always make it stiffer by beating it longer. So I hope that answered your question. Okay, so all I'm going to do is turn this table with my left hand. And like I did previously when I was doing the crumb coat and even with this green frosting, I'm just gradually moving my hand up as I go. So it's just making this like kind of cute little subtle ruffle. And if the frosting pools, which it will, you can just kind of wipe it. Oops. You can just keep going like that. The other thing you can do you can do like little waves as you go. Like, so with your hand, you would just go back and forth like that. So it just gives it like a fun textured, it's not as uniform, but this is what I mean about forgiving. I can just go back over and get rid of those little kind of more wavy ones and just go over the top again with these straighter ruffles. And this is, again, this is just like, it's a pretty textured, it's really, I call it like a pretty messy, like it's intentionally messy, But if you don't like that look, just use that straight, just take a bench scraper or take like a straight edge cake comb and just make it straight. But I think I'm going to leave it kind of just a little crazy today with its little cute little ruffle. And so now I just frosted some more of the frosting along the top, and then I'm just going to smooth it out. And then I'll show you a similar technique for the top to just kind of give it a fun little design on the top. Oops. So if you just take, let me rewind for 2 seconds. Your cake turner is your best friend at this point with these techniques, because you're going to let it pretty much do all the work. You're just going to hold your knife pretty steady. And then depending upon how comfortable you are, this could be a pretty fast process, but I'm just going to show you kind of the slow-mo version. So I'm just dragging out the spatula just a little bit as I go. So it does this fun little spiral on the top. So there we have our, let's see, I realize I use the word fun a lot, but I just really think this is really fun. And I think the cake is fun too. So this is now like our canvas. This is our blank canvas that we can now use to go on and load on some of these fun things that hopefully you will find when you go to Michael's. I found that it sounds so cheesy, but I say it all the time, but I feel like it doesn't take much to take something that's kind of ordinary and make it extraordinary. And I can't tell you how many times I don't say this to be like, oh, people like compliment me on cakes. That's not my point. My point is sometimes I feel like a little bit of a poser because I look at like some of these fun things that are available to just add to these cakes. And I think, oh, I'm so glad that you think this cake is so cute, but I promise you can do it too. And it like doesn't take that much effort. It doesn't take that much time, but like, if you want to think that I'm really great at this, that's fine, but the joke's on you because I promise that anyone can do it. And that's what's so great about all of these products is that they're so fun and they like crack open your creativity. And this is also the point where I say there's no right or wrong way to decorate it. So I am going to take, let's see. So available at Michael's too are just different cake tips. I don't have the number on here, but you know where they are. You know where to find them. There's so many different ones. They're so easy to use, fun to play with, versatile. They give you so many fun different looks. So I just have a piping bag here. I have a few different tips that I might use, I might not. But those are also a really good resource for you to have when you're at this stage of decorating. And one trick, I guess, that I do is instead of using the couplers, which if you're highly organized and don't have little hands that are, rifling through your drawers and you can keep them together and not lose pieces, then that's amazing for you. But I actually prefer to just use my pastry bags as the coupler. So I'll just put different tips. I'll show you, like, I'll just use different tips in different bags. And then when I want to use a different tip, instead of like screwing it off and putting it on and whatever, I just take the bag out and then I put it into another bag that has the different tip. So whatever works for you. I've just found that that works well for me. And especially when, you know, you have different colors and different looks that you're going for me and my brain, it's just easier to like plop this out and plop it in. So anyway, all right. So let's see. No questions at this point? No? Just gonna play. Okay. So one thing that I have found about myself that I do that I didn't really know that I did until someone pointed it out to me, is I kind of start with the base, putting another little row of frosting so that it's tacky and can stick. And then I'll take some sprinkles and just put them around the base. It's kind of like one of my initial first things that I tend to do. And that's because as we like start layering and putting stuff and adding stuff, it's hard to get into the little nook and cranny of the cake base if it has, you know, gumballs and candy and sugar layons and whatnot. So I'm actually going to mix. You can see right here, I was just mixing up mixing some of the sprinkles, which also is so fun to do. You can make your own sprinkle mixes because we have all the jimmies, all the sequins, all the nonpareils, and so many colors, sanding sugar, and you can make your own. So, okay. So I'll kind of start like this. The other thing I should say is that with this being the front, it's a little tricky because I'm going to try to do it from reverse so you guys can see me adding things. But normally, obviously, if this were the front of your cake, you would flip it back in front of you and decorate the front. So you had a better angle and better access to it. But all right, so let's see. I'm going to cut open some of these cute lollipops. The other fun thing we don't have out here right now, but there are a lot of meltables that are available to you too. And those are like candy wafers that you just melt in the microwave, and you can do lots of fun things and drips and shapes and things with them. So those are also so fun to incorporate into your cake designs. If you go back and look at some of the past classes that I've instructed on here, you can find some of those tutorials as well. So, okay, so let's see. I'm going to start with adding a cute little lolly. Circle little lollipop there. And you can see I just kind of I took a little bit of frosting and like piped it onto the side and then made sure that it was sticking to it. Because again, with the buttercream frosting, it tends to get like a really thin little crunchy shell that forms a few minutes just sitting out at room temperature. So like some of this stuff, let's see. So like, I mean, that'll stick, but not very well, right? So I will probably go back with the frosting when I start adding some of these other things so that it's tacky enough so that it all sticks together. So let's see. Can you see that if I'm at that angle? Okay. Okay. So this is just like an open star tip. And we're just going to start piling and adding. Again, there's no right or wrong way. Sometimes I feel like I get a little carried away and that I should stop when I'm ahead, but you know what? You're the artist at this point. So you just do whatever you want, whatever feels right to you. I try really hard in life to be minimalistic, but it just doesn't ever work out. It just doesn't seem to work for me, but that's okay. And this will be evident when we're done doing this cake together. But okay, so I'm looking at this and I'm just thinking, how fun would it be to just kind of do like a cascading, cascading coins up the top of, let's see, top of the cake. Can you still kind of see? Okay. So we're taking this. Let's see, we'll add. Any questions just while I'm kind of having this time to get creative? Okay, so we got some of those guys on there. And let's add some. I'm going to switch my tip and just put it in a little bit smaller of a open star tip. I'm just going to add a few little dollops rather. I'm going to take these cute rainbows. We'll add just like there. So fun. All right, I'm going to take some of these cute little candy rods. Whoa. I might need to put these out in this bowl so I have a little bit better access. Oops. Trying to do Roy G. Biv as best as I can, but I don't know that we have orange ones in there, but that's okay. Jello green, blue, purple, but we do have pink too. We'll sneak pink in there, right there. How's that? So I apologize if the minimalist vibe is your vibe and this is causing some angst while you're looking at it. But again, I just think it's so fun to just play. And like you can see here, I'm actually just thinking, okay, I want to add a little bit more color to some of these jimmies. So I'm just mixing in some more, and I'm going to do some stuff here in the back of the cake. I'll still come and add some more things, but and again, even though there is a front and the back of the cake, you can still make the back so cute. So we'll just kind of repeat. With this one though, I'm gonna kind of lay it more flat on the cake as opposed to sticking. See how this one's like perpendicular to the cake? This one I'm just putting like flat onto the cake, just like that. And we'll take some more coins. The other thing that's kind of helpful with doing these kind of over the top cakes with a bunch of these different things that you can add is that if you do have some blemishes on your cake that you don't love, right? Or if you're like, oh, like you can see right here, the cake is kind of showing through just a little bit. You can use these sprinkles and candies and things to kind of hide some of that. So again, probably no one in the entire world would notice except for you looking at the cake. But for me anyway, it kind of gives me a little bit of solace knowing, oh, I can hide some of these little blemishes with candy and no one's going to be mad about that. Oops. Okay. So kind of similar, just did like a little bit of a cascading look there. We're gonna put a rainbow there. And I've already have. We'll add some more of these cute rods. So fun. Okay, let's see. Add some gumballs. So another thing that I'll do sometimes is like I'll cut the lollipop stick and do, I don't know if I can do that. And then do one that's like a little bit higher and then do one down here that's a little bit lower just to kind of create some dimension. We'll add. The other thing is like I would encourage you to do is like raid your pantry and look for any other kind of just fun treats, chocolate covered pretzels, Oreos, like just anything, you know, or if like, for example, for us this weekend, my cute mom made chocolate chip cookies. Like you could, you know, put little cookies and put them around the cake. You can just use anything. And again, no one's going to be mad when they take a bite of their cake and there's like a little chunk of a chocolate chip cookie that they also get to enjoy. So, yeah. See how we looking time wise. Okay. So now I'm just taking some of these cute little gold, these cute little gold balls. I'm just pressing them. These I'm a little more deliberate about placement, just because. We'll do the same with the back side. Okay. Oops. All right. Now I'm going to take, so I want to show you something just to illustrate how this frosting has set up. And especially if you want to come back and add sprinkles. Like if I right now were to try to put these sprinkles on, you know how sometimes you can just toss sprinkles and they'll stick? This is not the point in the exercise that will happen. So if you want to add sprinkles, then a couple techniques that I'll either do is I'll just take some of the frosting on my fingertip, and if I just kind of know generally like where I want to put some, I'll just kind of rub it on just slightly so that then when I go to put them on, they'll stick. The other thing you can do is just take like a little bit of water. I'm talking like tap your finger a little bit slightly into the tiniest amount of water, and then those will stick. And then you would touch the frosting. Where else did I? Oh, there we go. Like, where else did I put it? And then the water will help with those sprinkles to adhere as well. So because I kind of have tacky fingers that have a little bit of frosting on there, I can still kind of go around and put some sprinkles on my finger and then just stick them on to the cake. And they'll adhere. So kind of fun, friends. Cute little cutie. Okay, so we can maybe we'll add a few more things just even to the top. If we don't have very many questions, and I can just keep going and zenning out, then I will. I definitely will.
Right, so-
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay, so a couple other things that you could do like inside of the cake is you could, I've done this before, where you can take money, real life money. But what I've done when I do that is like I'll wrap the money in saran wrap and like make sure that it's protected from the cake because you never know where the money's been. And you just want to make sure that like it's not gonna like make the inside of the cake dirty. But you can also like do little toys, you know? I'm sure you've all seen like the doll cakes where they, you know, you put the doll in there, but you like wrap their legs in the saran wrap as well so that it just protects everyone and everything. Um, but yeah, you can get creative. You could I don't know, my son needs to ask someone to prom here in a couple weeks. So you can put a little note inside, but again, you would want to make sure that you protected that with some of the plastic wrap so that it doesn't get all like cakey, literally, and gunky. So yeah. How are we feeling about our cute little friend? We're gonna grab one of these. So now I'm just kind of doing some on the top, although you see some of them fell off and that's because it's dry on the top as well. But at least when you put them on the top, you have physics on your side because it's flat and you can put the sprinkles on and you can just kind of like press them down. Whereas when it's on the side, right, you're kind of having to deal with them falling. But here you don't so much. What do we think? It's coming together. So you can see with like with these chocolate coins, I've buoyed them up with some of the gumballs. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. Like if you want to put anything like upright on your cake, you can just prop it up with something behind it so that you get the achieved desired effect of it being propped up. See, we'll add some M&Ms. And add, I'm going to put a little dollop of frosting on the coin because I'm going to add a little bit, a little rainbow to the coin. Because why not?
Says they love it.
Oh, whoever says they love it, thank you. That is so fun to hear. And I promise, you're gonna love yours too when you make yours. It really is so fun. One of my favorite things is like often I'll just teach cake classes like locally. I've done it for friends, I've done it for youth groups, for schools, businesses. And the amount of just pure like concentration and just seeing people get so into the design of their cake. It's like one of my favorite things. All of a sudden, like the room will become quiet and you just look at these. I mean, most of the time it's kind of more adults, but even with kids, you just see these, everyone is just so focused on their cake. And it's such a fun release. And I consider it therapeutic, right? Because you can just block everything out and you just are focusing on the important thing right in front of you, which is like, where am I going to put this piece of candy on this cake to make it exactly how I want it? So I'm excited for you guys to try to try your own. So yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty cute. I have all the faith and confidence in the world in your ability to do something that looks like this. And again, I would say that like oftentimes in life, you know, we see things and we think, oh, wow, I could never do that. But then when you learn how to actually do it and realize that it's just all about having the right resources and the right tools, it's actually a pretty simple thing to do. So are there any questions? Oh, yes, let's cut the cake. Cut the cake, of course. Oh my goodness. Okay, one thing to note though, because this wasn't the cake that I filled in real time, this is going to have different stuff inside of the center. I didn't have the cute gold coins, so there won't be any gold coins in there, but it just has like candy and sprinkles. But I do need a knife, and we're just gonna look, we're gonna see, we're gonna give this here butter knife a go. Okay, one other word of caution or advice rather is I would make sure that you put your cake, if it has all this fun stuff inside, I would just cut it on a sheet or like on a parchment paper so that like if it all starts to when it all starts to fall out, then it's caught and you're not forever picking up tiny little sprinkle balls that roll all over your kitchen floor. So, okay, where should we cut? I'm actually going to cut from the back just so that I can get a cute picture of the front, if I'm being totally honest. So, okay. Now this is just a butter knife, so we'll see how this works. Can you see that angle okay? Now, normally I would take like a spatula. Here, we're going to remove some of this and lift the cake off with the spatula, but we're just going to pull it off with the knife. But look how fun. So see, it's got sprinkles, candy. And again, with the other one, if you put more fun things in there, it will have way more fun that falls out. So, all right. There's no questions. Then thank you so much for spending your afternoon with me. I love this. I've been doing this for lots of years. It's been 15 years since I opened my first bakery. Feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago, all at the same time, but I still find so much joy because I just have strong feelings about celebrating people and special moments. And St. Patrick's Day is definitely one of those days that, you know, you can go all in and just create fun memories with the people that you love. So thank you again for being here. Check out more classes with Michaels, and I will see you next time.